Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you for joining us for one of our talks today. Today, we're joined by the wonderful Isabella Gomez to talk all about her new HBO Max series, Head of the Class. And you said that you've mentioned that the audition process for this was actually a very quick process, and there wasn't too much time to kind of stop and think about what's the voice of the show going to be, how am I going to approach this character. Did you find that in a way that actually almost helped you at that point because it really forced you into a space of just having to really intrinsically feel out where you felt this character was going when you first got the initial scripts and sides?
Totally, totally. And I was also lucky enough that I did get to meet with my showrunners, Amy and Seth, before I had to say any words out loud. And so, because I got to talk to them, I knew a little bit about the tone and what they wanted to do. And they walked me a little bit through Alicia and all of that. But it did actually really help to just kind of jump in and be like, it's do or die, sink or swim. And you kind of just got to like trust your gut. Which was great because I had been on a sitcom for years. And so I was like, oh, I know what I'm doing. But what I had forgotten is that I hadn't developed a character from scratch like that since I was 18 years old. And so that was harder than expected. And so I'm really glad that at least for the audition process, I got to just kind of like dive in and do what my first instinct was.
But even beyond the audition process in developing this character from scratch, it's also about the way that you're continuing to develop her episode by episode. And you're also kind of almost choosing which details to introduce us to episode by episode as well. And so, what did that journey look like for you in terms of the way that you like to map out that character development or the way that it just naturally progresses as you get to know her better as well from playing her more?
Well, I learned a long time ago that with sitcoms, we don't totally have the luxury of knowing the arc right from the beginning. And I think especially for this show, it changed so much from the pilot to what we ended up doing and with the characters, with the kids, there were kids added, there were kids taken away, and like all of that. And so we didn't have the luxury of like, here is Alicia's entire arc and like figure out what you want to do with her. And so I really took it episode by episode. And especially at the beginning, we were kind of shooting out of order. And I was just very lucky to be around people that I really trusted, especially Phil Lewis, who was one of our in house directors for One Day at a Time, directed 9 out of 10 episodes for Head of the Class. And he's an executive producer and he is incredible and brilliant and sitcom royalty. And so I really bounced so much off of him and made sure that it seemed right in his brain. And then acting, I feel like, is just kind of a trust fall from there. You just kind of got to make sure that you trust your director and your showrunners and your writers, and then that's it.
I love that you brought up Phil Lewis because, to your point, you have that history and you have that creative rapport with him. And so, what did that collaboration look like when it carried on to set and you were working on specific scenes? Because I imagine the two of you had already a shorthand, and then, even with this particular character, developed even more of a specific shorthand to this show.
Absolutely. It was such a blessing and thank God it happened because we also didn't have the luxury of time with this show. When you're working with minors, it's real tight schedules, and we actually shot a ton of content. We were shooting like 50, 60 page scripts, even though sitcoms can usually land more around like 30, 40, because they're only 22 minutes really, usually. And so we were shooting so much that we didn't have time to sit down and like analyze every single scene and make sure that we're all talking about it. And because a lot of the kids were a lot newer, of course we wanted more attention on them. And so we were very lucky that Phil and I already did have such a shorthand, and very lucky that I had come straight off another sitcom with, Rita Moreno and Justina Machado and Todd Grinnell and Stephen Tobolowsky and Marcel Ruiz, who are comedic geniuses. And so I was very prepped and I was very ready. And Phil held my hand through it and was just the greatest.
Yeah. And I love that you were mentioning in particular Justina and Rita from One Day at a Time because you've mentioned how that was a really key component for you in taking on the lead role in this show and being in every single scene of it, pretty much, that you'd had the opportunity to really watch how they led a show and that you wanted to kind of encompass and try and carry some of that through. So what were the things that you'd really observed through them over the years that you really wanted to carry forth in yourself on this series?
My God, so many things. I was literally just with Justina last night telling her how much I learned from her. Um, they are both such powerhouse women, but are also very secure. They don't need to be loud to know what they're saying. And I especially learned from both of them how to be in a creative collaboration gracefully. I think the idea of a diva and all of this comes out in Hollywood because I don't think that our actors are taught how to communicate their needs and their creative expression. And frankly, for a lot of time in Hollywood, we weren't encouraged to. We were, a lot of people hire us to say lines and you shut up and you come to work and you say the words. And thankfully, I have been part of productions that really cared about what I had to say. And I was part of One Day at a Time, where I learned how to do that in a way where I'm still respecting the script. I'm still respecting everybody that created the world. And I'm still understanding that my idea is not what we're servicing. We're servicing a story. And so I think that's the biggest thing that I learned from them.
And when it came to developing Alicia as a character, and in particular thinking about who she is as a teacher, obviously the scripts give you a lot to jump off of and play with and all of that. But for you, what were the important components? Because you're playing her from a place where she's someone who comes across incredibly open, even when it's the principal that everybody else is afraid of, she's like, no, I'm going to get to know this woman. Like, this is all going to be great. And real positivity as well in the way that she exerts herself with everyone around her. And was that a really important facet to make sure was part of her core for you?
Totally. And it was a really fine line because it has to seem really genuine that she's doing that, because if not, her relationship with the kids can seem a little inappropriate very quickly. Like, she's overly comfortable for sure. And so I really, what I did is I kind of tapped into a younger version of myself, and also kind of myself within this project, of this energy of not really knowing 100% what you're doing, but wanting to do it with the best intentions. And that's kind of what I tapped into. And also, I am admittedly a lot more like Alicia than people would think. I'm definitely under confidence, definitely a little bit of like in your face, loud, especially in the beginning. Definitely my go-to for bonding with people is like getting overly confident, I mean, overly comfortable way too quickly. And so I just kind of heightened that to a sitcom level, and I think it worked out.
I kind of love how she comes into a lot of scenes at an 11 and then she kind of almost reads the room and steps back and dials it down. Like,
Mhm.
even just announcing something to the debate group is, I made a sign, I spent money on it, I'm going to break through. There's a music moment. This cost $60, but it was worth it for the 2 minutes.
Yep.
And then it kind of dials down a little bit. Was it kind of fun to find the different energy levels and energy tracks where she comes in that way and then you kind of see where she ends up once she's grounding herself with the rest of the characters in a scene?
Oh my God, so fun. I think that's what's most exciting about sitcoms, is that you get to be big and it makes sense. And what was really fun about working with Phil and working on this show and this creative team is they trusted me enough to let me play a lot of different levels. And so, really, editing also helped a lot for that transition. In that, a lot of the time we would do a take that was real sitcom, and then start bringing it all the way down to more of a hybrid single cam version. And then Phil could go in and figure out which made more sense for the story. But I definitely really loved playing with all the energy levels, because clearly, as you can tell, I am a super chill person in real life.
But as well as the different energy levels, you also get the opportunity to play with different comedic stylings. A lot of the comedy comes from a dialogue driven place, but then there's physical comedy moments like breaking through that banner, or just the moment where you're sitting on an exercise ball bouncing up and down throughout an entire scene. And how do you kind of work about really figuring out what are the different types of comedy that I need to be able to bring for specific scenes?
I mean, really, that's all on the page for us. Our writers were pretty specific about the kind of comedy, and it was really clear. But for the comedy, for me, it was really just kind of, especially the physical comedy, you just kind of gotta do it, if that makes sense. I remember at some point during my run on One Day at a Time, I did a physical comedy bit that I was really nervous about, and it got a really big laugh. And one of the writers was saying that they loved giving me physical comedy because I didn't care about looking pretty. And that kind of clicked in my head, where like I think there are so many incredible actresses in Hollywood who are done a disservice very early on because they're told that if they're not attractive, then they're not a leading lady or they're not whatever. And I think especially for comedy, being cute is not the point. And so I'm really glad that I learned that early on. And I just kind of threw myself into it.
The show also gives us details bit by bit as we watch more of the season about how she ended up in this teaching position, her background graduating from an Ivy League, working at Google, and clearly having a bit of a burnout. And so, how in depth did you want to get in terms of the details that you peppered and added into her backstory? Because it informs so much as to who she is as a teacher in particular.
I did a whole bio on Alicia. I actually did it when we were filming the pilot. Pilots are so hard to film. It's so hard to figure out the tone of the world, and especially this is a huge cast. I think it's like 9 people and mostly kids, and so we went back and forth with Alicia a lot. And so by the time of rehearsal week for the pilot, I was feeling really not grounded and really unsettled. And so I sat down and wrote a couple pages of her bio, her past work wise, but also just as who she is as a person. And then I called my showrunners and was like, I know you don't have time for this, but we're going to sit down and talk about this for a little bit. And they were like, absolutely. And they were just the loveliest and so supportive. And so I fleshed her out pretty good. And then that just kind of bled into the season.
And was there a little bit more time when you came to shooting the rest of the season to kind of step back, reflect on what you'd kind of discovered through your performance in the pilot, the conversations that you'd had with everybody creatively, and then really look at, okay, what do I feel is really working with this character and what are the places that I really want to continue building on her?
More than time, there was Bill definitely came up and was like, hey, this is the version that we liked. Because again, we shot so many different levels of her. And he was like, this is exactly right. Your instinct here was perfect. And go with this version of her, which was really helpful. Because for the pilot especially, there was a lot of versions of her. And so thank God for Bill Lawrence being like, here's where you should land.
And at the beginning of the season, it kind of feels like for her, she sees this as a temporary stopgap. Like, I'm here teaching for the moment. I happen to get this job. It's going to be fun. I'm going to enjoy it, but I go home at the end of the night. And then obviously that really shifts and evolves with her relationship with the students and how she feels invested in a different way by the end of the season. But to your point earlier, where you obviously didn't have the entire arc, was that something that you knew you were building towards, or was that something that you almost learned that you were building towards episode by episode?
Well, I think I knew it just in that if we get a season 2, she'd have to stay. And so I figured she would stay. But also it makes so much sense for her. I think the reason that she was a perfectionist and the reason that she burned out at Google was because she cares. And she cares almost to a breaking point. And I think that's who she is at her core. So I think her coming into this job being like, oh, I don't care, this is just a stopgap, was her trying to convince herself she was always going to care about these kids. She was always going to get too involved and she was always going to end up being changed by them. And so, of course, that was always in the back of my mind during the season.
And you were bringing up something before about her enthusiasm and the way that she is with students, but also that there is that line of professionalism as well. And for her, she's learning a little bit of that, but also there's never any moment in watching the show where you feel like she's gone too far. It's like, okay, maybe you shouldn't have walked across from a coffee shop with the students. You should have gone a separate way. But that's kind of about as extreme as it gets. Was there a little bit of a dance in finding what those lines were of how kind of comfortable she could be, but making sure that there was still that feeling of professionalism within the show?
Absolutely. And not so much professionalism, because I don't know how much she comes off as a professional, but just a sense of boundaries. And also because I look so young, it's very easy to get me confused with the students. We all look, like we're peers. And so there was definitely a lot of talks, I think, especially higher up, that bled into the scripts, that then bled into my performance, to make sure that I stayed a teacher. And then especially then once we were on set working and stuff, making sure, these kids are so freaking brilliant and are so funny and sassy and quick that sometimes that could come off as like being too comfortable with me. And then we'd have to be like, okay, hold on, you can't be that sarcastic to your teacher, and vice versa. And so that was like the tweaking we did, but it mostly came from writing.
Yeah. And in terms of the fallibility that you build into her, some of that also comes from this is a brand new job. She's never worked in this position before. She's never worked with students. You know, even learning those particular lines is part of that fallibility. And you were talking earlier about how it was important for you for her to be a character that makes mistakes. And yet, as a teacher, she also has to exude confidence and kind of not show it a lot of the time. So how did you navigate where you wanted to kind of let us into seeing some of the moments where she's like, oh, I don't know if I maybe should have done that way, or where it needed to have that cover of confidence over the top of it?
Well, I think anytime that she's with the students, she has to be doing her best to seem like she has it together. So it was when I was with the adults that I got to really show a little bit more of that vulnerability and that deer in headlights. And deer in headlights, especially with Principal Mary's vulnerability with Elliot, they were kind of like her go-tos and her rocks for those kinds of things, which was really lovely. And I did want her to not be solid and not be perfect at her job right away, because that's so unrelatable and unlikable. And I think even for the kids, like, she still makes mistakes around the kids and they know it. And I think that that's important because it makes her like reachable that way, that they can connect with her and they can feel like she's being authentic and not just trying to like get into their faces and their lives. So that's I feel like I divided it by characters.
And sometimes they even film her mistakes as well.
Oh my god. That poor girl.
It's also, you know, with what you were saying about, you know, she's a student, she's a teacher that's closer to the student's age than a lot of the other teachers, and so there's a lot of interesting dynamic, and some of the comedy comes from a place within that as well. And it gives you a really interesting space to play between, I imagine, because you get those opportunities where you can look at where is that commonality that she really has with them, because they are close-ish in age without being the same age. But at the same time, she's had this whole wealth of life experience and is still older than them. So there are all these spaces of a real distance as well. And was that kind of a fun gray area to play around with and figure out where those two different divides existed?
Totally. And it was fun too because I was figuring it out in real life. Like, art definitely imitated life on that one, because I came into the show being like, oh, our kids were 14 to 17 while we were filming. And I was like, I was 17 6 years ago. I'm young, I'm hip. This will be nothing. We'll all be friends. And then I got in there and I was like, oh my God, these kids are so much cooler than me and I don't even understand what they're saying. And they're like doing little dances the whole time. And I was like, what? But I was still trying to lead the show. And so I was basically doing the same thing in my real life. And it's something like we still laugh about all the time. Like in the group chat, I'm always like, Grandma Isabella coming in. What does that mean? And they're like, Jesus. So it kind of worked out in that way.
And were you filming this show in front of an audience, or was it just the crew on set? Because obviously everything's shifted with COVID protocols with a lot of
Just a
that.
crew on set, which was such a bummer. I'm hoping that if we get a season two, we'll get to have an audience, because it really changes the game.
Yeah. And that was something obviously that you got the chance to do with One Day at a Time. And there's such a great immediacy in the feedback that you get in that moment. And it really allows you to kind of play around. Did you find that that really influenced a lot of the pacing and the rhythm that you found, particularly when it came to the comedic timing of that show?
For One Day at a Time, absolutely. I mean, we always said that the audience is another member of the cast, and they're just as important as the rest of us. And it really showed. Like, we would always, you rehearse all week long, and there's just a certain magic and a certain something that is breathed into a scene when you get your first laugh, and you just kind of lock eyes with everybody that you're doing the scene with, and it feels like magic. And it's just a wave that you can't ride unless the wave is there. And so we adored having an audience, and it was such a joy. It made it feel so special too. I always say, like, there's something about single cams in movies that feels a little bit what is the word, anticlimactic, because you just kind of yell action and cut and then you move on and you're like, did we do it? Whereas on a sitcom with an audience, it's a show night, and you dress up and people come and hang out, and there's an audience and you get to talk to them, and you get their feedback and you get like the adrenaline of like the alts right there. And so I adored it, and I really hope we get to do it for this show if we are lucky enough to get a season 2.
Yeah. I also think that this show does a really great job at creating a lot of dialogue, approaching a lot of themes and topics, but never being heavy handed about it. It's not kind of like, oh, this is the episode of the week, you know, we're going to have a special conversation about this thing. It just kind of flows through the characters. And was that something that everybody involved, that it was important to them, that be how the show approached creating a lot of discourse and a lot of dialogue?
I think so. I think they were really, we didn't also know exactly who our audience was going to be as we were shooting. And so you want to keep it light in case it is going to be a family show, which it ended up being. And so I think that was important. And I think it was also important to set up who these characters are going to be and get us to know them before we get into really specific conversations. And so I think they wrote that line well. And I think they really like then did the balancing act of it is so charming and funny and sweet that sometimes you forget that they're touching on subjects and then moving away kind of quickly. And then they're so freaking cute that you're like, oh yeah.
And, you know, obviously your character is going through this trajectory where she kind of steps back and learns a lot from the students around her. And so in a similar parallel for you as a performer, what are some of the things that, given how many ensemble scenes you got the opportunity to do with those actors on the show, that you feel you really got to observe and learn from working with them so much?
My God, I think being flexible. I think that obviously that's always really important as an actor, but I got so used to working with my cast on One Day at a Time. We were on that show for 5 years that you kind of get into a rhythm. It's as much of an office job, I guess, as you can have in this industry because you get used to the rhythm of it. And then you get thrown into this thing where you're in a different position. And now I was one of the kids on ODAT and now I'm the adult. And you have a whole different crew and a whole different show. And so you learn very quickly that you can't fall back into your patterns. And children are so good at that. And I mean, I call them children and they would hate that, but they're children legally. They're adults in their brains because they're incredible, every single one of them. But they, especially our newer ones, are so free and are so willing and able to show up for whatever it is that day is going to be on set. And that was really cool to watch.
Well, I've enjoyed everything in the first season so much. We'll be crossing my fingers for a second season to come our way. Thank you so much, Isabella.
Thank you.